what we've seen now is the manifestation of what Silicon Valley creativity is. South by Southwest is the best example. Art is not just fine art museums, but at the core of it, that new generation of creativity that has come out of technology and out of Silicon Valley is at that confluence of film, media, music, and it is, I think, closest to what you would probably see at South by Southwest. And I'm sure there's lots of incredible now technology CEOs and people who've made a lot of money who are acquiring art in the way that they would in New York or London. But I just think it's a very different ethos as to what creativity is and also what culture is. There is a climate crisis that is happening, that we're part of, that we're experiencing, however we think about it. And there is this kind of inequality shift, which is probably a crisis, although we've had inequality in the past. And then at the core of it, I think technology has led to its own crisis of isolation and loneliness. It's led to misinformation, misunderstanding, unkindness, a lack of empathy. I think if we added it up all over the world, for all of the billions of people who use the internet, there's probably a lot of hurt that has come with this experience of being connected, ironically.
Are you human?
Hello, Kamala. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for finding time. I know it's very busy. I've been waiting to have this conversation with you for so long. Circle of friends and colleagues is more artistic than, I guess, than mine. You're working on the verge of art and technology. And I know that you've been working with British Library, Design Museum, and then you finally decided to you felt the need to create a platform for all those people who have ideas which should be heard by the wider community, and you started the open-ended. Let's start from the very beginning. Why did you get interested in this?
So I grew up mostly in Pakistan, and my mom is from India, my dad's from Pakistan, and then I ended up going to university in America. My dad had also done his undergrad in the US, and it felt like pursuing a liberal arts degree was the right
Yes.
path at the time. And I went to America at quite a complicated time, right just after 9/11. So as someone coming from anywhere else actually at the time, but particularly a Muslim country, it did take me time, I think, to find a space and to figure out what I wanted to do. And my first job was in investment banking in New York, very early days of my career, but also a very different time on Wall Street, um, before the financial crisis. And I never really felt like it was for me. I never really felt settled. But of course, what I loved about New York was the museums and the art scene. And I
Yeah.
had a lot of friends who worked in galleries. And then my sister did her undergrad at UPenn, and after that joined a gallery in New York. So that became very much my fun world, but not my life. Even though I'd grown up, my mom has an art gallery in Islamabad, and my whole, family are creative. So I ended up going to do my master's after a couple of years at the Kennedy School at Harvard, studying international development. I was very interested in doing a PhD in economics at the time. And of course, growing up in a developing country, I felt very drawn to understanding better what development, quote unquote, meant, and what the divide between the global north and the global south was, and how I could help and work with organizations like the World Bank, or look at the time newly emerging, I guess, industries like social entrepreneurship as a path towards navigating my career. And I think at the time I was very invested in this idea of how can you do good from an outside perspective, and how can you help to incubate better economic situations for people living outside of a Western context. So I did that, and it became a lot more research driven in terms of the work that I was doing, looking mostly at macroeconomics. I was lucky I got a couple of papers published actually at the end of it, but I also found it to be very lonely in a way. Academia is lonely. I now teach it, so I'm aware of that from a research perspective. And I felt like I wanted to be doing and being around people. And so in a very long-winded way, I ended up very luckily joining Google and moving to California. I got a call from a recruiter asking me if I was interested in a strategy position in Mountain View. And so I just went. And when in those days, this is like 2010, I think. I mean, even now it's amazing. If you go to the Google headquarters in California, it's like a dreamland with, everybody looks happy-ish. Everyone is on a mission. Everyone is, kind of seeking something. And coming from, much more kind of serious world of economics, and before that Wall
Mm-hmm.
Street, which was obviously serious, but also, felt much more intense. I think of Wall Street as a very dark place in my head. I think of like 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. and, um, you know, the pressure of having your BlackBerry at the time, kind of buzzing. That was all gone.
Pagers? No, that's not. That's already gone, right?
Yeah. So then anyway, so that's very boring, but that's how I ended up in California. And then from there, was very lucky to join Google at a time where, even though it was still a very big company, it was smaller than it is now. And there was a lot more flexibility in moving from, an engineering team to a business team to a partnerships team, in really working with mentors and senior leadership to have a career that felt like it suited any one individual's journey. And that's what I was lucky enough to do. It wasn't always easy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think companies and big companies probably never really are, but it was really the beginning of my journey. And so, to answer your question, is how did I end up in the art and tech space, is that during my first couple of years in San Francisco, I spent all my time in the office. I was there
Mm-hmm.
all the time. You had to commute. I lived in San Francisco, so you got on the Google shuttle. You ended up
Mm-hmm.
an hour or 2 hours later in Mountain View, and then you never really left. So your entire life became about working for Google. And there was people working on projects with lucid dreaming and machine learning. There was people working on politics. There was people working on the internet and the truth. And there was a group of people who were interested in art and culture, and how to bring more art onto the internet, how to bring better quality images of paintings and more immersive experiences in museums online. And so I became part of that early group, and kind of followed that thread as a part-time project for the next 5-6 years, while I worked on other stuff, which we can talk about, mostly product stuff. And also at the time I was writing, I wrote a bit for Architectural Digest, I wrote a bit for Condé Nast Traveler, I wrote for Vogue in India. I don't know why. I think because, you're sort of, my life just became much more contained in a way. And so I probably was like way more productive than I'll ever be. And also was the energy of being there in California at that time. There was an intensity of it, and there was a sense of trying out everything all at once, because,
Mm-hmm.
that's what Google was doing, and that's what all of these
Yeah.
technology companies were looking to do.
Right. But did you feel more drawn to the way of working and creating in Silicon Valley than what New York was offering you? Because as like you said, New York offers lots of cultural events. There's lots of galleries, and it seems, at least in this stereotypical way of thinking about New York, it's all the artists, all the bohemia,
Yeah.
American bohemia is there.
So at the time I lived in New York was when everybody was getting pushed out of Manhattan. So I'd say leading all the way up to COVID, New York became, or Manhattan became, more and more and more expensive for anybody creative to live. And so it was a time of the beginning of this kind of, consumption of Damien Hirst sharks by people like Steve Cohen, and massive like acquisitions of art that were very much about showing that
Mm,
wealth and art were intimately connected. Moving to California, I found very difficult. I found it to be isolating. Everybody that I knew pretty much worked in technology. And I found that to be quite hard and quite narrow. And also, it was, for me, I'm not from America, as such, it was pushing away from the rest of the world, because, it is very insular in a lot of
and
ways.
individualistic, right? Like,
Exactly. And, at the end of the day, if you think about that period of time, it was a period of America kind of turning inwards, looking away from the rest of the world, feeling very vulnerable after 9/11. And the sense of the outsider was very palpable and became more so in the time that I was there, which, of course, I didn't really understand. But I do think that from a creative and arts perspective, what we've seen now is the manifestation of what Silicon Valley creativity is. South by Southwest is the best example. Art is not just fine art museums. And that's a lot of the work that I've done. So, of course, San Francisco has beautiful museums, the SF, MoMA, and, you could go on and on. The Young Museum, of course, they have the ballet. But at the core of it, that new generation of creativity that has come out of technology and out of Silicon Valley is at that confluence of film, media, music. And it is, I think, closest to what you would probably see at South by Southwest.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's lots of incredible now technology CEOs and people who've made a lot of money who are acquiring art in the way that they would in New York or London. But I just think it's a very different ethos as to what creativity is and also what culture is. And that's something that at the time, I didn't really have the space to engage with. That wasn't really my world. And also, I think that has evolved quite a lot over the last 15 or 20 years as a space. But for me personally, I think I was quite lonely in a way. And one of the most interesting experiences I have, I don't think I've probably really talked about it, but was I was part of one of the very early groups that were curated by Sheryl Sandberg. When she had just joined Facebook, she was writing her book Lean In, which I don't actually, I haven't read it for many years. So I don't know how I feel about it now. But at the time, it was great to have a woman
Something
leader
different.
writing about her career. She worked at the World Bank. She was at Harvard, and she ended up in tech. So I found that very inspiring. And she would bring together these groups of women, or she started this, kind of journey of it, where we met every couple of weeks at somebody's house, and it was quite structured in terms of being led by a mentor. And she had chosen the people to be there, and I was really lucky. A friend of mine invited me. Who was working at Facebook at the time, and there was human rights lawyers, doctors, child psychologists who worked in war zones, venture capitalists, incredible women that I would never have had the chance to meet if it wasn't for that, because I was in my, even though Google was huge, it was still my work world. And that for me really opened up California from a completely different angle. Allowed me to, meet a wider discourse of people. But art, culture, and creativity, I always felt like I was in my experience of it was less, and I did find it difficult. And I think the bigger issue probably was like I was still getting to know myself. I was in a different country, in a different time, working in a different organization.
Yeah.
So that was that. But I think one of the things you mentioned was, being like Wall Street versus California. But I actually think that, and this comes down to creativity, critical thinking, and how I think of my own work, because I've worked in many countries. I've worked in, all over Asia. I was based in Singapore. I've worked in India. I've done projects in Africa, Latin America, and of course in the UK and Europe. But for me, I feel that I might be wrong, but I had an American education, and then I worked for American companies. And I think that actually shaped my way of seeing the world, and how I worked and how I learned to work. I don't know if it's right or good, but I think part of that, like, there's a restlessness that comes with
Yes.
it. There's a kind of probably over excitement about, getting things
And
done.
confidence and gaining confidence, right?
Maybe a confidence, which definitely does,
Of course helps,
doing
especially
a
in the
job builds your
artwork.
confidence.
Yes.
Having a boss ever. But I think there's an American energy, and I think that's a very creative energy, as you know. It's really much of the world that we live in today. And that's something that I don't know how to make into a formula. And I don't know if it's the right thing, like I said, but I feel that's more what shaped my career than anything else.
Definitely. Yeah, and you had your voice heard, and you were able to create this
Yeah.
this how to say, to infect your energy and enthusiasm about art and the need for more conversation. around your community. So hence open-ended, right?
Hence open-ended. Yeah, so I started open-ended a couple of years ago, and that was actually during the pandemic. And I started off, as you were doing, as a series of podcasts.
Yes.
And I was really interested in nurturing this space where I was lucky to sit through my work at Google, which was where art and culture and technology come together. And I got more and more interested in the space of design during my time working in London on the Google Arts and Culture team, because I felt this like very strong connection of design as a practice to technology. Because at the core of it, we talk about AI now all the time. What is it? It's algorithms that are stacked and organized and designed and shaped and implemented. And it's not just how your iPhone looks like, or how the experience of holding your laptop is. So for me, design and technology really felt like there was like a creative connection between the two fields, and I was always very inspired by people working in design, because they could be computational designers, they could be architects, they could be artists who are doing work with digital, and of course it could be people like myself. And that whole world of creative technologists for me always sat within where design and technology met. And so I was interested in hosting conversations in that space with people that I knew who are of my age group, or, kind of working in and around me, who had always inspired me. I've always had mentorship from people who are probably at my level of existence, but come from outside of my own way of working. And so that's how I began the podcast. And it shifted a little bit. I had started off wanting it to be like more about heroes and design, heroes in tech, people who've changed the world. Similar to, when I went to Harvard, I wanted to work on like saving things. But it was a journey that I went on to really try and figure out like who is your hero and who do you want to celebrate,
and whom you can relate to.
yeah, and who do you want other people to hear from, and where would you might learn the most from? You never learn the most from like a press conference by a CEO, or if you when I do panel conversations, I never invite like the head of policy or the head of marketing. Cares? It's not relevant what they think. What's relevant is the people who are building, who are making, who it's their opinion. It's not about what they represent. And for me, that's a really big distinction that we don't talk about enough. And that's really what I wanted to create space for. And so I have people who spoke, pretty much all of them I had already known. Some I had known much less well before, like versus after, but people who worked in human rights, design, architecture, technologists, engineers, scientists. And that's sort of the scope of the podcast as it began. And then it evolved really as I left Google, as I started to teach at Central St. Martin's on the architecture program, into much more of a space of incubating ideas and conversations at that intersection of technology, creativity, and design. And now we're actually working on raising capital for a fund, as we just realized that it's a growing space where people are looking at R&D in technology, R&D in AI, R&D in really building for the future from a creative perspective. It's creative technology, and where does it go? And it doesn't necessarily fit within what venture capital firms are investing in right now. It's not really gaming. It's not really NFTs or blockchain. And it's not really going to necessarily make the same amount of money in a year's time as the next gen AI assistant. But these are, a conversation.
It's needed. Yeah.
I think it's needed.
Yeah. How do you find the response?
Well, so the response has been in education, because I've been educating myself as to how does the venture capital industry work. And so I think I spent all of last year, which, in some ways I'm like, God, I wasted the whole year trying to understand the space of investing and where does it work and where would I find a space for this work. But part of it has been understanding that there's a gap right now. You have long-term investment in R&D in AI happening in biotech and in deep tech. The more creative incubation of products happens at Google and Microsoft. It happens in large technology companies that have the capacity to create those spaces, or of course places like MIT Media Lab and so on. But there isn't really a space that says, how do we do this in a way that is honoring the creative spirit of the work that's happening, considering a long-term perspective, but providing the support needed to give the technical solutions, to provide access to computational resources, engineering talent, and to build businesses. So, let's see. It's an adventure, it's a journey, but I do believe in it, and I think that trying to do it in the right way has actually probably been better. Because I think it allows us to honor the kind of work that's coming to us, and maybe create a space that ends up being part public, part private. Maybe more about venture philanthropy than venture capitalism, but that's something that hasn't really been written before as a new language. And those are the people you always want to be, is the people who wrote a different language, and maybe you know it and no one else does, but as opposed to doing what's already been done. Because sure, the venture world has, we have Google and Twitter and Facebook and whatever else because of it. But there's definitely other models. The index prize in Denmark was a great example of that. They now have a tiny fund, but they got a prize from the government every year, and they funded um, they gave the prize to Tesla, to Duolingo, to the iPhone, but also to incredible innovations in design that nobody would ever have heard of if there wasn't a prize. And so we have to find that balance, particularly with tech and particularly with AI, because it's a very brief moment in time in which we are given the opportunity to shape these technologies, and they will have long-term impact. And if we're not bringing in other voices from philosophy, from art, from design, from outside of just computer science and engineering,
Yes.
we're not giving really ourselves a chance of designing with whether it's empathy or humanity or all of the issues that you're interested in.
Yeah, you won't be addressing the whole population, right? Because it's so much more diverse than the bubble of the people who are designing at this moment. As you, like you said, also VCs tend to fund what they know or what they can quantify. And art is so ephemeral. It's just difficult to calculate value, but it's needed because it's created by people for people. So there is a value in it. It's just how to describe it, how to sell it, because you have to sell, and you sell anything and everything to the parties who can support you, either with funding or with reach. And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
are you having conversations with government? Like, are there any publicly funded grants, or maybe there is some I don't know, some kind of collaboration between, you could merge something between like commercial and non-profit world?
Yeah. So if anyone is listening to this and wants to get involved, I'd love to chat, because I'm speaking to a couple of universities. And that's where I see a space. There is a space for R&D and AI, and it is an academic endeavor. But we have to honor the IP and the work and the energy of people who are, whether they're creative or tech. I think technologists are incredibly creative. Engineers are creative. It's not to say that they're not, but whether it's people come from the more creative industries or the tech industry, they can't just be doing nice things for other people's service. And so where is the economic imperative that comes back to them, that gives them back ownership of their work? That's a model I'm interested in creating. So if there's anybody out there who's interested in that kind of space, I'd love to speak to them. And, to your earlier point of what's not quantifiable, there's an amazing book published last year by Ivy Ross, who's the head of design at Google, with Susan Magisman, who's at Johns Hopkins University. She works in the neuroscience department, and they talk about what kind of that confluence between art and feeling, and how the brain is impacted by art. And one of the things that I took away from that, probably feels quite obvious, but I hadn't actually thought about before, was how we measure feeling. How do we measure pain? If you or I were to get into a fight and like one of us scratched the other or whatever, how would I feel pain versus you? It's totally subjective. And in this moment with technology, we're experiencing a very subjective world. Of course, as you said, these systems are designed by a very limited group of people with very narrow data sets and outcomes, and their own beliefs and value systems. But even to say they, I think does disservice to all the people who are sitting in different offices and have worked on, building ImageNet or on computer vision, build the transformer model. It does them a disservice to remove the diversity of thinking and thought and experience that they bring to the table. And so for me, that kind of space of inclusivity in AI, there's a lot of language around it, as you know. There's
Mm-hmm.
governments talking about friendly AI, responsible AI, trustworthy,
Yes.
fair, ethical. We're throwing around a lot of language, mostly in English. But like, what does it mean to be inclusive? And
Mm-hmm.
that's a conversation that goes beyond what ChatGPT should build or what Gemini should look like. It's much deeper, and we should hopefully come to a place where we're not just naming a few big billionaires or multi
Mm-hmm.
billionaires and big companies, but we're talking about the ideas. What ideas are we building for, and for whom, and how, and why? What is inclusive? Is it to consider the so-called next billion users of the internet? Everybody's online now, to think about what's on the edges. The edges are indigenous language and culture, which is being lost. The edges are people who are differently abled, who have special needs. The edges are people who are extremely poor and didn't have a home to go to during COVID. Are we designing for them? Are we designing for what Google would not design for? Is that our tag phrase? Or are we designing for what works for our communities? Are we designing for our planet? We can't just solve everything by talking about what is inclusive in an instant. And we can't just be expecting that to be resolved by large organizations that have a clear responsibility to their shareholders, which is to make money and to make it in a very, very rush fashion in very short periods of time with what seems on the outside to be unlimited resources. But when you're on the inside, you're just part of this constant panic around budget,
Mm-hmm.
money, and share prices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I do think we live in a world of these multi-layered realities. It is completely subjective. And we have obviously more poverty and inequality than we ever had, but we also have these incredible ways of connecting and communicating. And I think mostly people feel like they're going crazy because there is such a pressure to figure out how to keep up with progress. And also, you sit and you look at how these technologies end up being so racist, so mistaken. The language is called, hallucination. Of course, they're not hallucinating, they're just wrong. It's broken, or it's overcorrecting itself because it's so
Mm-hmm.
worried. But is it
Yeah.
worried? It's a computer. Do we blame it? Do we sue it? These are such
Yes. Who
fundamental questions.
owns responsibility, right?
Yeah. And I just think we're not, no one person can solve it. No one conversation can come to an outcome. And that's why, to come back to this incubator, I'm just really interested in what creative people have to say, what they care about, what they do, and how they build, and to facilitate that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also worried about, like you said, like people who are designing or building things for the masses are usually the ones who have money, are in power, and those voices of those communities which are on minorities, or they are the special cases, right? They won't be heard, they won't be designed because they don't bring profit, like they don't count, in a grand sense of like how would I say, capitalism, pure capitalism, right? So I wonder, how can you solve it? Because companies don't want to do non-profit or they don't want to work as charity unless it's a tax write-off. So who should fund it?
I think it's a great question. I think we are in a crisis point, right? We talk about crisis, and I hate it. Like, I just, of course you want to roll your eyes because everyone's fine. We're all quite fancy. We live in fancy cities and countries. And I go to a lot of talks by like very smart people where they're like, I just want to tell you about the crisis that we live in. Like, we're not in a crisis. People in Sudan are in a crisis right now. People in Yemen are in a crisis right now. People in Palestine are in a crisis right now. We're fine. But there is a climate crisis that is happening, that we're part of, that we're experiencing, however we think about it. And there is this kind of inequality shift, which is probably a crisis, although we've had inequality in the past. And then at the core of it, I think technology has led to its own crisis of isolation and loneliness. It's led to
Mm-hmm.
misinformation, misunderstanding,
Mm-hmm.
unkindness, a lack of empathy. I think if
Yeah.
we added it up all over the world for all of the billions of people who use the internet, there's probably a lot of hurt that has come with this experience of being connected, ironically. And so the reason I say all of that is I do think that the big technology companies do feel in many ways that they're losing a battle of thought leadership in the space. Of course, they're very focused on money and resources. And as you say, you see them reorging their teams in order to make just a better version of Chat GPT.
Yeah.
And from the outside, losing track or losing perspective on the future of the world. When I joined Google, that's all, at least that was my experience of it. I just felt that all we did was think about amazing futures. I worked with
Yeah,
people
don't do evil, huh? They changed the
across
slogan.
people, and also like, where do we go next? In hindsight, I
Yeah.
think about what were the questions we were asking ourselves. I don't remember asking myself any questions. I learned to ask questions working, as I was lucky to do, with artists, with museums, with creatives, with people in emerging markets, with companies, with partners. I was educated by outsiders, and then eventually as a teacher, academia and critical thinking and frameworks. So I think the only solution is that you need more time. You need to pause, you need to think, you need to breathe, you need to not panic, because you can't just solve ethics by having an ethics committee. Having said that, I think big technology companies are coming to a point where they're going to have to question, what does it mean to have a space of thought leadership? Because they are set up with value systems, whether it was don't be evil, whether it is about innovation, experience. It's not ever been just about money. And that's a fact. And is that all that it comes down to? And is that what makes your life worth living or your company worth existing in a few years? Probably not. So I think that, of course, money will not necessarily come from the companies profiting the most off of this moment or the individuals doing so, but there is a sense of collective responsibility to avert the crises that we face. And for that, I think you'll see probably more thoughtful engagement with new companies that come out of the blue, with new research, with government policy as it's figured out along the way, in really fostering more thoughtful innovation. And that probably needs slower innovation, more
Mhm.
time, more space, more energy given to just letting people have ideas and not panicking, probably like they do in biotech, where I know they give themselves a lot more time than they do in,
I think
AI.
it got like it sped up
It's
a
now
bit
that we have
with all
vaccines.
the yeah.
Well, you would know. But the other thing, of course, is reallocating resources. Who are you giving your resources to, and who are you bringing to the table? If you have an ethics lab or an empathy lab, who are you inviting and who's deciding? And really reconsidering in a moment of possible humility the fact that you haven't got it right. And that only comes when your products start failing. When the thing you're meant to do stops working, you have to question yourself. And if there can be a space for introspection there, I think that's very powerful. The final layers are civil society and government. I do think, at the end of the day, AI regulation is going to come too late for AI. But as regulation, it's going to make us consider, what are we building for? If AI represents a fundamental shift, a paradigm shift in how we connect, what is human intelligence versus machine intelligence, if we are spending the time right now to consider the futures we want to have with machines and humans collaborating, with the idea of more than human intelligence living alongside it. And this is a time for governments to have a role to play, to educate themselves. I know the European Union is working on its 2025 legislation, which is obviously like way too far away for ChatGPT, but in a way is an opportunity for them to gather voices that come from, philosophy, academia, and of course from different communities, to think about what the futures of AI should be. And if we can come to a point where you have governments engaging with civil society on value systems that go beyond how much money and how much tax should so and so pay, maybe we have a new roadmap for what it means to exist into the future. And finally, and most importantly, it's not just up to the West. These technologies are coming out of Silicon Valley for sure, but where we consume them, who's paying for them, the world's demographics have shifted irreversibly towards, I think 40% of the world's young population will be in sub-Saharan Africa in a few years,
Mhm.
to India, to East Asia. And with that shift, that might not necessarily be a crisis, but it is a crisis for the Western world as we've known it in many ways. And with that, I hope for technology companies comes a moment of reckoning and thinking about, who are you building for, and why are you building the products that you build if it's not just to get a better version of what you're doing versus everyone else?
It just feels at this moment, I would love to experience what you are saying, that companies and governments should make mental space for people to think of, like, actually understanding whom should we design for and how should we design it, to make it a long lasting and like a beneficial component. But it feels like we are in a constant rush right now, even exponential rush between Western, or like US, UK, or Europe, and Asia, mainly China, in terms of the whole design and development around AI. And as much as I would love to, there is not so much news. There is not so much, at least I don't hear about development coming from Africa, for example. It feels like they are left to themselves.
I think that I agree. I think this is like now like very much part of this rhetoric of like, where is China? Where didn't we invite them to this conversation? Why are we constantly like ignoring countries that don't suit us? And I think the core of this becomes it's not just about tech, right? It's about geopolitics. Technology is built on physical land. You have data centers, you have fiber optic cables, you have resource extraction. A silicon chip, a GPU chip requires rare earths, and whatever else. And then of course you have all of the politics of power, which come with the AI politics of power. There's a really good book on it. I'll remember the name and mention it later. That was I recently read. So it's not just about how good is the internet. It's really about who's building and designing and for whom. And of course, we can blame ourselves. If you come from the global south, you can say, well, we should have had our act together. But on the other hand, you can think about leaning in. And I think that's a really good moment of reckoning for what comes next. I met in Davos this year the new Minister of Arts and Culture from Nigeria, and she's an incredible, very powerful woman. And she's working with the Minister of Technology on really thinking about how best to merge the two industries. And there was somebody in this lunch audience telling her about how which various tech companies could help her in her work and help her to digitize her collection and whatever. And she was really polite. And I just said, she's going to be helping them. What do we need to understand? How do we create more inclusive tech? How do we include other cultures in AI? How do we build better data sets and understand meaning in ways that go beyond our narrow context? Is to work with people like herself who are looking after the culture of one of the world's biggest countries. And obviously those conversations, the more you say that, the more people get annoyed with you, but it's true. We need her help. And so those who we look to now to advise us to design our future will have to come from other places, and they should be feeling the confidence to do that themselves. Of course, she's educating herself. She's trying to understand the space. And then another issue with AI is that people get so intimidated. They're so nervous. I met an investor the other day. He's invested in 2 big AI funds. One's a fund and one's a amazing neuroscience startup. And he didn't understand the technology and how it was being built and what was happening. And I said, well, ask them to share the research with you and walk you through it. And he said, I don't know if I'll understand it. They said the generative model works and it's better than the other one. That wouldn't happen in any other industry. You would want to understand what's happening. And of course, we don't know what happens, once it goes into the black box of the computer speaking to itself. But if the person who's built it can't admit that and say that, then we have a huge issue. So to come back to the demographics and the geopolitics, I think it's really terrible that we don't know what's happening in China. I think it's we should be having a lot more of a conversation on, what does it mean that America has blocked out, if this is the case, any kind of supply of microchips to China, so they can't develop, Gen AI technology. They don't have access to Taiwanese chips. Other countries are developing it. It's just so loaded right now. I mean, Taiwan is pretty much the only country in the world that's developing these microchips, and other companies are working on it. But if it's based off of finite resources, we should understand what the alternatives are and how this might play into global politics in the future, and also how this empowers or disempowers populations of people who should be benefiting from technology and who should be gaining from the amazing opportunities with, in this case, AI specifically, on health, on science, on we were talking about quantum physics, on, of course, creativity, on human connection. That's where we have a wonderful, we've seen already from AlphaFold to AlphaGo, these very, breakthrough moments of human innovation that have happened as a result of the support of these technologies. And that's where we should be channeling them. And for me, there's such a gap in maybe what the media presents, but also us really saying, if we empowered every culture, if we thought about Confucian values, I don't know, or the fact that there's 2 billion Muslims in the world, and what are their values? How do we believe in what they care about? Maybe that doesn't always align with how an engineer thinks about an algorithm, but that's where I think governments should be playing a role of thought leadership and about
Yeah.
like bridge building rather than like
Yes, exactly. Finding the common denominator.
yeah, I mean, like, my AI will be better than yours. Like, actually, it won't, because making more of the same right now is destructive. It will be evil. It will pull out the worst of bias, the worst of racism. There's great books by Kate Crawford and Meredith Broussard on this. And how do we invest in, opening ourselves up? And every day somebody sends me an amazing indigenous language app, or a new fund that's looking at thinking about how AI can be applied to protecting indigenous culture or to channeling ideas from indigenous communities. Rafiq Anadol, the artist, is doing a project in the Amazon that's so amazing and meaningful, but like, it has to come from the ground up. It should be coming out of Africa, out of the Amazon, out of India, out of tribes in Nagaland, without polluting their way of life. And it doesn't mean I have an answer for it, but I think the way we flip perspective is something I don't know how to do. I sit here giving you my opinion as somebody I told you, I've worked in America, I've studied there. I have a very particular opinion. And if it hadn't been for COVID and getting kind of lost in the mountains of Pakistan and, working with my students who are so traumatized after 2 years of being locked up, I don't think it would have actually triggered in me the same kind of feeling of, it's not about being mad at whoever built where we're at now, because we live in an amazing world, but it's about recognizing the dangers of the moment in which we find ourselves, recognizing the uncertainty which we have for the future of our climate, and also how we have excluded most of the world's population from progress, and how these technologies are actually only going to accelerate that exclusion. And what are we even doing about it? I don't see that future right now, and I don't see what governments are doing about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's a highlight of our conversation. I think it's like I really don't. It just feels like voices like yours are so distributed, but so like together they would be much stronger. They could be heard. Right now you can hear those voices every now and then, and in the end, like, they are so, how to say, like, diminishing with time, and with so much, like you said, so much anxiety about what media is presenting, what technology is providing, and people feel trapped, people feel lost in the progress, in a way.
Right. Or it seems very esoteric, because I do a bit of advisory work now, and, people want to know how to get from A to B. Like, what tools should I use to, how do I solve it? And I find that, there is a moment where we have to be brave and like, and tell truth to ourselves. And that's, so if there's people out there who want to come and be in a voice, I'd love to hear from them. But also, I've started to do, as of last month, as part of our work with Open Ended, gathering women in AI, based in London, to come and to meet. And of course, happy to find them online. And it ended up being women because we ended up having women, but it's not, it's creative technologists, it's natural language processing researchers, it's professors, it's engineers, it's executives from technology companies who share an interest, but also a knowledge of what's happening in common, and are mostly working on incredible actual work and millions of side projects. And so that's something that I would welcome, anyone who wants to connect and to engage, because I think that we have to think of this as a path forward. And I don't think, in my opinion, we can continue to worry about what happens to the future of the human. And I have in any one day so many thought pieces and new alliances for trusted AI and human-centered AI, and it's good, but also, it's a question for you at this stage: how do we define what is human? What is meaning? What is connection? What is consciousness? And really, if we are asking that question, what do we hope to get out of it when we have probably the most powerful tools at our disposal than we've ever had, with all these systems?
Do you think we will get answers to such questions? So far, we couldn't, we didn't manage. So what would?
No, I mean, that's very philosophical, right?
Yes.
I'm doing a bunch of work with a friend of mine who's a philosopher based in California. His name is Tobias Rees. You should look him up. He's worked a lot with artists, and he is a very important philosopher. But he comes from the Western tradition of what is philosophy, and I'm not a philosopher, but we have so much of this kind of friction around what is philosophy, who decides. The idea of the human, actually, or like consciousness per se, was actually, I think it's Descartes. It's not that old in like Western philosophy, but of course in Eastern philosophy, the self, the heart, the whole, consciousness, there, we kind of pass through so many layers of centuries and thousands of years to come to a point of defining even what consciousness could be in the Vedas, for example. And then you have science, quantum entanglement, quantum computing, which comes next. That will bring us to new ideas of what the self really means. And they hate the word consciousness. They talk about reality. And so I'm not a philosopher at all, but I do know that this is a moment where we have tools to allow us to consider where we stand. And, we have, let's say, one life, how we leverage all of these resources to create a better one for ourselves or for others. And so, if anything, in beginning that questioning of ourselves and stepping outside of worries about efficiency or automation or progress as defined in the Industrial Revolution, and just maybe being a bit comfortable with considering, who am I? It's not very esoteric. Everybody in tech, from Steve Jobs to, basically everybody has had some kind of spiritual guru. Ram Dass was the inspiration for Google's Empathy Lab, and so on and so forth. California is the home of Big Sur and Esalen. So these are not like weird conversations necessarily to have, but they're not efficient conversations to have because they waste time. And right now, actually, the more time we think we're wasting, the less time we probably have to come up with solutions. Because if we are to understand the science of climate change, which again, I'm not an expert, we have little time left to resolve where we sit right now. And I'm really interested in the concept of cathedral thinking, which is really like pushing 1,000 years into the future. Where could we be?
Mm-hmm.
In a really sad.
How do you define cathedral thinking?
So, cathedral thinking is actually an architectural term based around cathedrals, like actual cathedrals, which were built to last for 1,000 years in wherever medieval Europe. But a lot of designers and architects have considered it. There's a library in Norway, which has got a lot of famous authors to write books that will only be, I guess, unraveled in 100 years, I think. Margaret Atwood is one of them, Elif Shafak. And there's something about the paper, like the tree also for the paper is going to show up in 100 years. It's kind of an indulgence that you can probably do in Scandinavia. And you don't have time to do that if you're deforesting mountains in India or whatever else. But the idea of like being able to take the luxury of extending time forward and to look at what happens with glaciers as they explode in the Himalayas. This is why your AirPods are usually better.
All right.
But yeah, glacial melts, what happens with the future of mountains? How do we consider? We don't have 1,000 years for that. The ecosystem around the northern areas of Pakistan and India and Tibet is shifting extremely rapidly. These are scientific facts. It is because of climate change. It's because of pollution. It's because of a lot of human designed interventions in our environment. And we don't have 1,000 years to solve for that at all. It's more how do we deal with the implications of that, the impact of it, what happens in the next major flooding event in Pakistan, what does that mean for displaced populations and people. Everything is not just going to be about tech. It's going to be about empathy. It's going to be about conversation. It's going to be about the application or allocation of resources in an efficient way, and a consideration by the wealthy world or the global north that we're all in it together, for better or for worse. The Minister of Climate of Pakistan had actually said this in an interview a few years ago. She said, what happens in Pakistan doesn't stay in Pakistan. What happens in a major flood somewhere up in the Karakoram Valley, where I work on a bunch of conservation projects there, has an immediate physical and energetic impact on the rest of the country, which extends to the rest of the world in so many different layered ways. And of course, that's going to be the case all over, with cyclones, with weather patterns, with migration patterns. And that's what scientists are working on. Tons of people are investing a lot of money in this space. It's not that things are not being done, but I think what the internet or technology or even this moment of AI should remind us is that we're not just connected in these very ephemeral ways by bits and bytes. We're connected by the physical world which we inhabit. And if we can channel that as a positive connection of love or empathy or even desperation to survive, in this moment, we should be thinking of it in a very positive sense. And we should be using technology for all of the efficiencies, from robotics to self-driving cars to travel to space to science to health. But at the core of it, why we're building, I think, is something we should be reconsidering.
Definitely love and positive emotions are moving people to, like, you strive, either what's the theory, right? Like, you either try to avoid pain or seek pleasure, love, and all the positive emotions. But then there is also this, and I'm just trying to understand what's more effective for people to take action. There is this this thinking that you should stage a crisis, even exaggerate something to for people to take action, even from what all the this clock which says we are 3 minutes to midnight, or like 2 minutes to midnight, running out of time in terms of the climate change. What do you think is the best way to make people relate that this is, maybe right now they are sitting in a comfortable chair at their home. It's, they have access to water, to clean water, to energy. But actually, if they don't do something about something positive about preserving nature and environment, we are all to blame.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't want to totally contradict myself, but I think that it's very hard to know, because there's so many of us, and we are, although connected, we're also culturally quite separated, is where you start. I don't think panic is an answer. Obviously not. I think about this from a technology first perspective. So the thing that I'm interested in is a lot more of a technology focused lens, is really how we empower people who work within technology companies, those who no longer need to work for just one organization, creative technologists, and also policymakers involved with tech, to realize that there is a great opportunity to come together to create spaces of connection for coders, engineers, computer scientists, researchers. The space I'm really interested in is where we can really empower technologists, people who are coming technology first, whether it's people working within large organizations in tech, people who are engineers, computer scientists, researchers in the space of computer science, creative technologists, computational designers, really anyone working at that very strong intersection of technology and any other practice is who I want to be speaking to. And of course, policymakers who are engaging in this space. At the end of it, as we've discussed, everything is very holistic, everything is interconnected. You can't really separate now what happens with AI or, tech in general from human progress or disaster. But at the core of it, I think there's an opportunity for us to find each other, to find common voices, to invest in work and ideas and projects that feel meaningful, and also to think about how we can be reconsidering not just our value systems, because as I don't think anybody really that I've ever worked with has expressed extreme racism and therefore manifested a chat GPT version of it, but to have thoughtful spaces of collaboration where we can afford the luxury of that slowing down, of creating incubators for ideas, for questioning and manifesting out of it. We can't create that for the whole world. We can't voice that upon governments everywhere, but I would urge policymakers in the space maybe to create those spaces. As you mentioned, government. How can governments, outside of just the Western context, but even, in this country, create more opportunities for investment in, we say slow fashion. What about slow AI? What about slow ideas in AI and R&D that is about cross-disciplinary insight and innovation, and not just about a rush to beating the next guy who made the same thing in a different way. And I think that is very possible. It's not unachievable, and it isn't as overwhelming as thinking about the whole world not being solvable, because we can't afford to do that, and we don't have time for that.
And what do you think about the impact of AI in the arts, music, film industry? I saw the other day this guy, I have this, yes, Tyler Perry, who is an American actor and a filmmaker. And he was creating this 800 million studio, and he put it on hold when they released Sora. They open AI video, like text to video platform, like algorithms. And this guy Perry said, I no longer would have to travel to locations. If I wanted to be in the snow in Colorado, it's text. If I wanted to write a scene on the moon, it's text. And this AI can generate it like nothing. I
Okay.
guess so many. And what was happening with the protests with
Hollywood writer strike and actor strike. So I'll tell you briefly on this. So I think there's like a huge issue with law. This is going to be about IP ownership, trademarks law, and really, it'll be the same as if a self-driving car hits somebody. Is who owns what? Who's in charge? And I think this is going to be a seminal shift for employment, of course, for the creative industries in terms of what is new, what is accepted as new, and who owns not just the economic rewards of doing something amazing, but obviously the life rewards of being an important actor or writer or producer and getting the benefit of living a life where you experience every high with every film you've produced or been part of. So I think that's a whole other podcast, which I have thoughts on in terms of what happens with the future of film media and content. I think the idea of text that you touched upon is actually very central. Language. How do we decide that language, that is where bias comes in? That's way more interesting to me than the conversation on racism, because it is so subtle, it's so nuanced, and it's framing the visuals of how we will experience the world. Why should language decide? Why should only people who are literate or who can speak or who can communicate, why should it only be in English? That it all ends up manifesting in different forms of media. And that's where I think we have a much bigger conversation. And I don't know how to get in touch with Tyler Perry. I don't know much about his work, but I would be interested in that. It's like, why should it be words from a particular language that are designing the world that we experience? And then this question becomes around the images, where they're sourced. What does it mean to describe relaxing or soft or intense? What does that mean for Sora versus how would that mean in a totally different context? And so I think that's really where the future of how or the present, I guess, of how we unpack bias, racism, perspective in AI is really going to manifest. And Sora is interesting, but it's not that surprising. I'm not that
Mm-hmm.
shocked that it exists. It's beautiful. But, is it okay for me to call it beautiful? Because, it's going to destroy in many ways a lot of creative endeavor that could have manifested in that way. What does that mean for us at the end of it? Those are answers that are not
Mm.
very clear.
No, of course. And in a way, Sora is generating, the outputs are very much Western. And there are so many different ways each person can show through film, through music, the same emotion in completely different context, in completely different way. And I'm not so sure AI will ever be able to reflect to what you wanted to say, what you wanted to show, to present, like the way you feel as a producer. I'm wondering, will it be will it be support, like will truly creative people, they be supportive of it, and will they find benefit in it, or they will still try to create those indie alternative.
So the issue we have then is like us knowing what we want and us knowing that we can seek and have ideas and have a spontaneous experience that leads to the new chapter of a book or a new image or artwork, the spontaneity of your own feelings and perspective and time and the weather and the temperature and the smells around you. That is like all fact. The question is about, the confidence we have to continue to believe in ourselves. How do we nurture culture, creativity, artistry? That is something that we really stand at risk to lose, and stand at risk to lose very quickly if we allow these tools to take over. Of course, it could happen, but it also depends on how what we value in society. Do we value people who can spend their time considering, you know, the context of a particular artwork, the melody of a particular song, a beat? What is the lived sum of all of my experiences of music, and how would that manifest versus an AI where I put in a few keywords? It would sound similar probably to what I would want it to sound like. But like you
Mm-hmm.
said, if I knew what I wanted, it wouldn't be good enough. And the issue is us losing the ability to know what we want. And that's the core of, I think, where we'll have to go
Yeah.
next in
And
interrogating this. And I think it's
yeah.
a really long conversation though.
Yes, and I think also there is a meaning in finding what you want through almost like pain, trying and failing and retrying, and that takes time. And with AI, you can pretty much generate lots of things in an instant. Maybe that doesn't bring so much satisfaction.
Well, I mean, I'm involved with a lot of arts institutions, two big dance institutions, which are all about the body, showing up, being present, connecting,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
feeling,
mm-hmm.
remembering, thinking about intelligence outside of just the cognitive. I'm
Yeah.
involved in museums, the arts. I know writers. I'm writing a book right now. And I don't believe that you're going to be able to source or sort that kind of creativity without the experience of it, without the
Yes.
years of feeling and being and the stories you bring to the table for so many reasons, both biological and scientific, as well as a lot more my own perspective. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that will be where we go next. But I do think we're at risk of losing all of that because of the expediency of technology. And I think with the cultural and the creative sector, we're going to see a seminal shift. We'll see a shift with film. We'll see a shift with music. We can't deny the fact that music is being generated by AI, that a lot of it will be very popular. The same with art.
Yes.
We have less probably to say about that with performance art,
Mm-hmm.
with events, with venues, with concerts. So I think there's going to be a recalibration in the creative industries, in the entertainment space, and in the art space, and that is very scary.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to impact creativity. It's going to impact human creativity. It will make us consider what we value in terms of great writing and poetry and music. But the truth of it is that the publishing industry has struggled a lot in the last several years. It's harder to get your book published if you're not a well-known
Yes,
individual.
you don't have
And
community.
so the shift is happening. It's more the extent of it is difficult to measure and map. But the thing I agree on is that you can't, of course, go to a concert. Last night I went to see the London Philharmonic at the South Bank Centre in London. Wayne McGregor had done a beautiful choreography using his own dancers from his studio to a piece of Polish orchestral music, actually. And an artist, Ben Cullen Williams, who's a very good friend of mine, had used machine learning to create an artwork that was engaging with the bodies of the dancers and the sound.
Mm.
Beautiful and fluid and intense. He used technology, but you had to be there to see it and to experience it. You wouldn't have known the experience of it in any other way. And that's a privilege that I had to be there. And that's where my concern is like, what becomes a privilege to create and to build and to experience art versus what is entertainment? And that
Last question. So, what would you say for us to? How should we cultivate our creativity?
I mean, I'm maybe not the person to ask that question, but I would say the things that we should cultivate anyway: self-awareness, meditation, mindfulness, time in nature, time with art, music, family, friends, things that give you joy and happiness and make you feel whole, things that give you space to consider yourself, all of that. For me, we in the same way that we become sort of roboticized with efficiencies, we do in our daily lives. Where do you find your own voice? What do you believe in? Keep a diary, keep a journal,
Yeah.
all of that, I think. And then most importantly for me is surround yourself with people who inspire you and figure out ways of making that part of your work, whether you're paid for it or not.
Exactly, and create, right, and show it. Share it with wider public. I think this is great because people can connect through work, through art, through creativity. It's been my pleasure, and I hope you will have amazing weekend and all the best and lots of good stuff to your parents. And
Thank you,
I
Kamala, and
hope
thank you for your
we
time.
will meet in person soon.
Tell me,
Yeah,
I'll invite you for my next dinner also.
definitely. I would love to.